Well, today's our last message in this series we've called Blessed. And we've been looking at the life of a very interesting character, is how I would term it. His name was Jacob. And God is blessing Jacob, even though probably most of us sitting in this room today would not think that Jacob deserved to be blessed. Would you agree? He's a deceiver. He's a cheat. He did everything that if you and I did it, our elders would be at your door talking to you. But God's continuing to bless this guy. Now remember what our definition of blessed is. It is God's good fortune, strength, and presence in my life. The most important part being the presence in my life. Now, if you've not been here the past few weeks, let me give you the Cliff Notes. Anybody know what Cliff Notes are? That's how I got through college. Cliff Notes. Jacob was a younger brother of a guy named Esau. And when Jacob was younger, he deceived his dad, his dying dad, into giving him a blessing that was supposed to go to Esau. And when Esau found out, he wanted to kill Jacob. So Jacob ran for his life. And while on the run, he met a woman. Her name was Rachel. He fell in love and he wanted to marry her. And so he worked 7 years for Rachel's father, Laban, to have her as his wife. And the deceiver got deceived. Because when he woke up, he found out he didn't marry this beautiful woman named Rachel. He married her ugly stepsister, Leah. But he got both of them. And so he worked another 7 years. He got Rachel. And after that, between the two sisters and the two servants that he was given, Jacob ends up having 12 sons. And they become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the question in my mind as I read this story, why in the world does God keep blessing this guy? Why does God keep doing that? Because God doesn't bless us because we deserve it. You're sitting here today in the United States of America because this is where you're born. And that in and of itself is a blessing. We don't deserve to be here. But we are. We don't deserve it, but God still blesses us. And here's the fun part. Just like Jacob, God blesses us in spite of our mistakes and our failures. Can I hear an amen to that? Because if it wasn't for God blessing me in the midst of my stupidity, or mistakes and failures, I guess I said, if God didn't bless me in the middle of that, he's not going to bless me, period. Because that's me. I am a mess. And so are you. And we live in a fallen world and we live in sin. We don't practice sin, please, I understand. We do our very best not to be in sin, but we do. And in our lives, we sin. See, when we left off last week with Jacob, he was telling his father-in-law Laban that he wanted to leave. And so Jacob goes and tells his wives and the kids, they need to pack up because they're headed back to Jacob's homeland. Now remember, Jacob's been gone for about 20 years. He's not been around. And so after Jacob gets the family loaded up, they take off. Actually, listen, they kind of snuck off because they didn't want Laban to know that they were leaving. And so when they start to get a little closer to Jacob's homeland, he starts to get a little bit nervous. No, let's be honest, he gets scared. Okay? Because what's Esau going to say? What's he going to do when Jacob shows up? Have you ever been upset with someone? You've never talked about it with anybody? What usually happens? It grows and it grows and it grows. Can you imagine what it would be like if you held on to that for 20 years? Would you be in a good mood If you were Esau and here comes Jacob back home, I think Esau at this point in time is probably furious. And so Jacob's thinking about this, and he says, okay, I'm going to send a messenger, and I want him to check things out. I want him to let Esau know I'm coming so we can get an estimate of the anger level that Esau has. And so when the messenger comes back, he tells Jacob that, well, it's not good. As a matter of fact, Esau's putting together 400 men to head your way. Ouch. Oh, man. So Jacob went from being a little scared to now being terrified, because his assumption that his brother Esau did not put this group of men together, these 400 men together, to be a welcoming party. His assumption is he's coming to get him, and he's going to kill him. Can you guess how terrified Jacob is? Esau brings in 400 men to kill him. So Jacob decides at this time he's going to do two things. The first, I bet some of you have done this. You left home in the morning after you had a fight with your wife. You made sure the flowers got there before you did. Try to appease things. That's exactly what Jacob's doing. Jacob is sending all kinds of spices and animals and food to put Esau at ease, to appease Esau, take away some of the anger that he's got, put him in a good mood. That's the first thing he did. Then the second thing he did is he divides his family and the rest of the possessions that he has into two groups, because he's thinking, well, if Esau shows up with 400 men, if he attacks this group can get away. And if he attacks this group can get away. He's thinking he'll save at least half of his family and half of his livestock and half of what he has if he does it that way. So now let's pick it up. Now let's see what the Bible tells us about this in Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32, we're going to start in verse 22. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched. And as he wrestled with the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." And Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he replied. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him right there. And Jacob called that place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." And the sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Now, if you've been in church a while, I'm sure you've heard this story. I'm sure you've heard about this WWF wrestling match between God and Jacob. You know, it happened, and it happened all night long. You know, I can't imagine wrestling with somebody all night long. I have trouble wrestling with my pillow all night long. Right? Neither is wrestling. I want us to go back and look at verse 28. The man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Listen, if you go back and you start and you read the whole episode of Jacob, you will find that Jacob's been trying to get this blessing in very many different ways. And most of them, he was being deceptive. And his attempt to receive the blessing by his own devious devices, it stopped this night. It stopped this night because he had a direct encounter with God. Folks, when you read that, if you've grown up in church, you just read it, boom, and it's over. We don't give a lot of thought to it. But for somebody, I would love for Spielberg to make a movie of this. Because I can't imagine what a good imagination would do with this story. I know what my imagination does with it. It's a crazy story. Here's a story where a man wrestled with God, or at least an angel, and he survived to tell about it. To me, that's absolutely incredible. I can't think of a better way to end this series than with this story right here. There is still more life ahead for Jacob. If you want to read it, get into Genesis, start in chapter 27, and go till the end of Jacob. Because it's an incredible story of his life. And they'll go on to do some very incredible things when you read ahead. But we're going to stop the story with Jacob here because I just thought this was a perfect ending to what I'm trying to get across during this time. This morning, I want to give you two things, just two, that I take away from this story. I don't think they're the main point of the story, please understand that, but I do think there are two things that we need to take away. Number one, all of Jacob's encounters with God happened while he was alone. There's an interesting thought. All of his encounters with God would happen when he was alone. Through the messages, can you remember how many times Jacob and God had one-on-one conversations? First, the dream, right? When he was on the run, his head was on the rock. And then there was the conversation after Laban wanted to steal from him. And now he wrestles with some kind of heavenly being. 3 encounters in 6 chapters. That's amazing. And it seems like every time Jacob gets in a situation where he's angry, where he's scared, he gets away by himself. And that's when God shows up. Do you think there might be a lesson there for you and I? Can I just make an assumption this morning? That when most of us get angry or scared, the last place we go is to be alone with God. Most of us, if we're angry, we want to fight. And sometimes we fight with the wrong person. We're angry over here and somebody says something over here, so now the fight comes over here. Jacob got angry, he went off by himself. And God shows up. And you know what happened when God shows up? He shows off. He lets you know that he is the one who can answer the questions you have in your life. Can I just say, I love when we get together. I love Sunday mornings. I love it when Derek leads us in worship, or the team leads us in worship. That's a great time for me. But probably the times that impact my life the most is when I'm completely alone with God. That's when my life changes. I love to go to Brown County. Down to the trails down there, just to hike and to walk. Haven't been able to do that for a few years. But what I do is I go down there and I find me a nice quiet place at a picnic table, or I find a place along a trail, and I just sit. This stays home. Because that, in a heartbeat, can take me away from God. And I'm there for one purpose: God. There may be something going on in my life I'm confused, I'm angry, I don't know what the next step is. and I know where to go look for it. And that's what I want you to hear this morning. You've got to go to a quiet place to get off by yourself so that God can change your life. Because if you're not finding a time to get alone, time to spend with God, how about this as an illustration? You're trying to fall in love with somebody over Facebook. Ain't going to happen. But yet that's what it's like. God speaks to us when we get away. Now, listen, Bible reading is awesome. Need to do that. Devotional time is important. Do that. But it's the times when we are driven away, when we're by ourselves, that are the most powerful in our connection to God. You know, for some people, it's amazing because I've been around them when they're sitting alone in a waiting room. That's when God touched them. Just recently had a conversation with a guy that was sitting in jail. A lot of alone time there. And he was telling me how that he spent a lot of time with God. Probably the closest encounter I ever had with God is after Joan and I had a fight. And I left the house and I got in the car and I started driving. No idea where I was going. Wasn't paying attention. And I started to cross the railroad tracks, and guess what? That train was way too close. God and I had a very long talk right after that about my anger. And it hasn't been the same since. The change took place. God blessed me when I was being stupid. He blessed me in the midst of my sin. He blessed me in the midst of things that were going on. So listen, the next time that you find yourself in one of those places, I want you to remember what we're talking about right now. I want us to just stop and to ask God, what are you wanting to tell me? Because if you listen, He will. So many times in our prayer lives, we think it's all about us talking to God. But there needs to be time in our prayer lives where we do nothing but sit and listen for God. Because He'll speak. And we need to hear what He's going to say. So the first thing that we learn and we need to take away is we need to get along with God. The second thing that I think we find in this story is very simply this. God's blessings, they may force you to face your fears. Oh, man. Can I just tell you that God in my life, and probably some of you can agree, but God in my life uses circumstances and situations I don't like. But that's what He uses. That's what He uses to grow me. That's what He uses to draw me closer to Him. You see, God tells Jacob, go back home. Because He wants to do what in his family needs to happen back there. But in order to do that, Jacob is going to have to meet up with Esau. I've had some encounters before of folks that had a little trouble with, or they had a little trouble with me. Are those ever comfortable situations? When you have to go to talk with somebody, when I was in high school, my sophomore year, 1976, I was putting my books in my locker. We had those little skinny lockers with a locker above it, and I was putting my books away in that locker, and I couldn't wait to get home because it's the very end of the day, and so I closed that locker, and I turned around. Boom. A guy, a classmate of mine, hit me in the jaw and knocked me out. And by the way, I got suspended 5 days for fighting. I didn't get to throw a punch. But I'll tell you, it was very hard to walk back up to Steve after that happened. Folks, it's not easy to face the fears that we have in our lives. I understand that. But yet, many times when God wants us to get closer to Him, it's the way that He does it is to take us through our fears. It's amazing. If you want God to bless you, so many times you're going to have to face those fears. In our story, if Jacob truly wants a blessing from God, he has to face his brother. Listen, he did the same thing to Moses. Moses didn't want to go see Pharaoh. As a matter of fact, he begged God to send somebody else. But God said, nope, Moses, it's you. And then how about Gideon? Gideon was a wimp, right? He was just a wimp. He didn't want to fight anybody, so he got 30,000 men together. And what God say? No. Not 30,000. Not 3,000. You're going to go fight with 300. Gideon had to face his fear. And look what he did. Let me ask you today, what is your greatest fear right now? What's your greatest fear? Can I encourage you not to run from it, but to allow God to use it? To face that fear and to see God's hand move in the midst of it? You see, as we look at this, Jacob's encounters all happened when he was alone. And God's blessing came when he faced his fears. But here's what I think the main point of this story is. If you let him, and you're willing to fight for it, God can bless you and change your legacy. Remember at the beginning I told you this was Jacob's most famous story. This is a story that people talked about anyway, the story that he wrestled with God. But we've seen through these last few weeks that Jacob was obsessed trying to get God's blessing. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. So this story shows us again, and probably gives us the best example of this, that Jacob wrestles with an angel. He doesn't quit until the angel gets tired. And that's a picture of a guy who's desperate. When you want something extremely bad in your life, what do you do to get it? What's the saying? Whatever it takes. Jacob wanted that blessing. And he was doing whatever it took. Even to the fact that he wrestled with God. That is a picture of a guy who is extremely desperate. He knows without God, he's probably going to get killed the next day as his brother shows up. But before that happens, he wants to get that blessing. That's all he's thinking about. Now, I don't know that you and I don't know that we'll ever wrestle literally with God or with an angel. But the idea here is that Jacob was fighting for God's blessing. Are you willing to fight for God's blessing? Think about that for a moment. Are you willing to be desperate for God's blessing? Are you desperate for the legacy of your family to change? Will you do whatever it takes? And you'll wrestle as long as it takes to get God's blessing? Willing to pray? Willing to serve? Are you willing to pray and serve? Listen, are you willing to wrestle with God about your husband? Or maybe another family member? Maybe it's someone in your family who doesn't know God. I love what Jacob says when he's wrestling. I will not let go until you bless me. I'm not going to let go. So the angel tells him that his name is no longer Jacob, but now it's Israel, the one who wrestled with God and he lived. What a name. Think about that. In that moment, Jacob's future, his legacy, will forever change. He went from being the deceiver to one who wrestled with God. I was in Kentucky this weekend for the board meetings of the college I attended, and we also had a homecoming. We had a lot of alumni that came back, and so we had a chance to sit and just to talk for a while. And I was talking about this story, and Jeff looked at me and he said, I know what it's like to wrestle with God. And I said, you do? What'd you do? He said, I had cancer. And I just laid on my bed. And all I did all day was pray for God's blessing. I didn't pray that I would live. I didn't pray that cancer would be gone. I prayed for God's blessing. And he got it. 4 years now. He's been blessed in such a way. Now, will God do that every time? No. No. Because God chooses who he will bless and in what way he will bless them. But I will tell you that God does want to change your future. He wants to change my future. He don't want us to be tied down to our past and our mistakes. And if we're willing to fight for it and wrestle with him, praying and serving and loving situations and times that seem hopeless, that's when God's going to bless us. I think about this a lot right now. Most of you know that my brother is battling cancer. So I'm wrestling with God right now. Some days I will wrestle, and that's all I do. Wrestle with God for my brother. Because I know he wants to change our futures. He wants it to be different. I want to show you one more thing that I love about this story. Need you to use your imagination a little bit here. The Bible says that the angel, the man, God, whichever you want to view that, touched Jacob's hip, and Jacob left that encounter with a limp. Think about that for a minute. If you're like me, you probably hear that and you think, that's negative. He hurt Jacob. Why would he do that? He hurt him. If I'm Jacob, I'm thinking, man, that stinks. Right? Why did God have to give me a limp? But who says a limp is a bad thing? There's a different perspective. I bet Jacob wasn't willing to see his limp as a bad thing. I want you to close your eyes for a moment. I want you to go with me. Imagine an old man walking down the street with a cane. Has a pretty noticeable bad limp. He comes over your direction and he starts making conversation, so you ask him how he got that limp. Now, you don't want to embarrass him and you don't want to be rude, but it's so noticeable you want to ask and you're just curious. He don't think you're rude at all. As a matter of fact, as soon as you ask him, he kind of turns his head to the side and gives you a big grin. He says, well, it's kind of a long story. And he begins to tell you about his life and all the mistakes that he made. But one night, as hard as it is to believe, he wrestled with God. And the only reason the angel got away was because he hurt my hip. That was the night that God blessed me. See, here's something that we really need to ponder. Only after we have wrestled with God can we see blessings where others see negatives. Only after we wrestle with God can we see the blessings where others see negatives. I'll bet every time that someone asked Jacob about his limp, he just smiled. Because it was that night everything in his life changed. It was that night that God blessed him. You see, others are going to look at that situation and they're going to think of the problem. They're going to think of the negative. But you know the wrestling matches that you and God, remember what I said? They had these wrestling matches about that. I got a dear friend in Cleveland, Ohio. She graduated high school with me. She had her first son, and her first son has some special needs. And we talked right after Matt was born, and she said, "What do I do? What do I do?" And I said, "You love him. That's all you got to do. Just love him. And you do what a mother would do. And everything will be fine." Matt's now 29 years old. He's a great kid. Her life was changed because of a special needs child she had. It's amazing what can change your life. The Bible says that the angel touched Jacob's hip. And after he touched his hip, he left that encounter with a limp. I'm going to tell you, others will look at your situation sometimes and they'll see a problem or they'll see a negative. But you know the wrestling matches you had with God. You know what's happening. Maybe you're so scared that you turned away from God and God said, no, come back here. Come back here. Maybe it's like bankruptcy. You know, I've heard Dave Ramsey talk on different occasions, and he talks about how bankruptcy was the best thing that ever happened to him. Because he was so arrogant and full of himself that bankruptcy sent him to his knees when he was alone, and that's when he met God. Bankruptcy a good thing? That's not how we see it, is it? But it's what changed Dave Ramsey's life. Sometimes blessings only come after you wrestle with God. Now, how do we wrestle with God? Well, one day Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. There was a judge in a certain city, he said, who neither feared God nor cared about people. A widow of that city came to him repeatedly saying, "Give me justice in this dispute with my enemy." The judge ignored her. For a while anyway, but finally he said to himself, "I don't fear God or care about people, but this woman's driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice, because she is wearing me out with her constant requests." Then the Lord said, "Learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end. So don't you think God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he be putting them off? I tell you, he will grant justice to them quickly. But when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on this earth who have faith?" That's how we wrestle with God. Never give up your prayer. Does that mean God's going to answer it the way you want? Not necessarily. See, looking back at Jacob. Jacob was praying in Genesis 32, 9-12. This great prayer he had. He confessed his unworthiness. He makes specific requests of God. And as if he needs to, he reminds God of his promises. Then right after that wonderful prayer of God's deliverance, he takes things back into his own hands. Trying to soften up Esau so he won't kill him. How many times have you taken things and say, "Here, God, this is yours. Now, wait a minute, I want this part back. Oh, wait a minute, God, I want to give you all that. No, wait a minute, I'll bring it back. I can handle this. I don't need God to do that." We give it to him and we take it back. That's where the issue arises. We've got to be persistent in what we're asking God to do. If you ask him to take away something in your life, give it to him. And don't take it back. Because you see, one of the great stories of our human tendency is to vacillate between faith and unbelief. Between trusting God with whatever I give him and attempting to do it in my own strength. You know, there's been some theologians that have interpreted Israel. They've interpreted that name to mean one who contends with God, because it fits with the picture of Jacob wrestling with God. However, in every other biblical name, the subject is reversed. For example, David does not mean the one who judges God, but God judges. Ezekiel means God strengthens. Therefore, I think in this story, when we talk about Israel, it is God contends. God's contending for Jacob. Now, he's got to get Jacob out of his own way so that he can get him. That's me. God's got to get me out of my own way so that he can get me to do what he wants me to do. And I'm going to guess that there's many of you sitting here this morning that are in the same shoes I am. That's how we think. Jacob came away with a limp. But he never had more strength in his life, because he now realized that the promise would not be accomplished by his scheming, by his deceiving, but it is only going to happen by God's work. Here's an interesting thought. Never trust a Christian who doesn't have some kind of limp. I've known Christians in my life that know everything. They are perfect in their own minds. Folks, if you don't have a limp, you've not wrestled with God. And if you're a Christian, you better be wrestling with God. He's the one that's going to give you the strength that you need to face what's ahead. You know, there's some kind of a story about if you're limping, there's been some kind of a story in your life where maybe you were scared badly or just felt completely hopeless. And after that, they went a few rounds with God. And that's when they found out they were blessed. Anybody in here limp this morning? I'm not talking because you got a bad knee. That limp don't count. I know that limp. But do you have a limp because you wrestled with God? And after that wrestling match, you discovered how blessed you are in your life? It's a pretty strong statement to say never trust a Christian who doesn't have a limp. Because I believe that any and every Christian has a limp. Because if you're truly a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ, you have wrestled with the Father. Now, there's some sitting here this morning, you're wrestling right now. You've never made that decision to follow Jesus. So you're wrestling right now in the presence of this company. You're wrestling with God because he wants you to make that decision, and you're saying, oh, God, let's fight about it. Or maybe you're thinking about becoming a part of this family here, which is a wonderful family to be a part of. And God's telling you it's time, and you say, and you got your heels kind of dug in. You're not going to stand up. I'm going to tell you, God's laid on your heart a decision this morning, and my prayer is that you will make the decision that God's given you to make. When you walk out these doors this morning, you will say, yep, I've accepted what he said today, or I rejected it. Two choices. What are you going to do when it's time for you to wrestle with God?